Hello and welcome everybody. We are here for another PowerPoint video, the second part to my promise for the 500 subscribers celebration. Just before, maybe a day or two ago, I released a PowerPoint on Karn Amulet and covering all of the details you need to know about playing Karn the Great Creator and Amulet. And as the second part of that, I promised to do a similar video on a Reclaimer Amulet. And this is kind of a pet deck of many amulettitan aficionados, including myself. I love to play Reclaimer and Amulet. I know that F. Paulus does as well, and Anthony Priolo, or Apriolo1, as he's called on Magic Online. There's a bunch of people who have Reclaimer near and dear to their hearts, and there's some really powerful things that Reclaimer is capable of doing in Amulet, and that's what I wanted to touch on today. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So, first of all, what is this all about? We are covering Elvish Reclaimer today, and Elvish Reclaimer is a card that adds a lot of flexibility and a decent power to Amulet as well. It allows us to find a land at instant speed by sacrificing land and tapping the Elvish Reclaimer, and there's a lot of intricacies to this card. So, first of all, in this PowerPoint, we're going to cover why we would play Elvish Reclaimer, when it is good, and when it has drawbacks, and how those drawbacks affect the deck. We're going to look at the changes to the Amulet stock list in order to play Reclaimer to the maximum potential. We're going to look at a little bit of sideboarding advice when it comes to playing with Elvish Reclaimer. And then finally, there will be a couple of example deck lists that I'll discuss with you guys. So, of course, this is all about the deck Amulettitan, and if you're not familiar with Amulettitan, then you need to check out my video, So You Want to Play Amulettitan, which is basically a beginner's guide. It gives you everything you need to know about Amulettitan, the rundown, and of course the link to that video and many other videos that I've done in the past like this are in the description below, as well as that Karn Amulet video as well. So if those are things that you're interested in checking out, then go and check those out. But today is all about this guy right here, Elvish Reclaimer. He even looks like F. Paulus, which is pretty interesting. If you've never seen F. Paulus, then check out his channel, because he's very, very good at what he does, which is playing Amulet better than me. Regardless, Elvish Reclaimer is a 1-mana, 1/2 creature. It has the activated ability to tap, sacrifice a land, search your library for a land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And then it also has an ability that says that it gets +2/+2 as long as there are 3 or more lands in your graveyard. So, just on the surface value here, we're looking at a 1-mana creature that's capable of tutoring any land into play just at the low cost of 2 mana and sacrificing a land. This is also a 1-mana, 1/2 creature, meaning that it will survive some typical format cards when it comes to Modern, like Lava Dart or Wrenn and 6. Those are two very popular ones, and of course, Elvish Reclaimer happens to dodge all of those, but pretty much everything else it dies to a shock from Kolaghan's Command if you don't have enough lands in the graveyard for the ability. It dies to Lightning Bolt and Fatal Push and Prismatic Ending and all kinds of stuff, so it is a little bit weak to removal. That said, going late, it can grow into a 3/4, and that helps it survive some removal, like an Unholy Heat that does not have a Delirium, for example, Lightning Bolt, that kind of thing. So it can grow out of reach eventually. But now that we've talked about the general process of this card, what it does for the surface level, let's talk about what Reclaimer does specifically in the context of Amulettitan. So first of all, it's worth noting that Reclaimer is only as good as the things that you're able to get with Reclaimer. In particular, Field of the Dead was a card that Reclaimer used to be used to tutor for very frequently, and if you're not familiar with the card is now banned in Modern because it was so ubiquitous. Reclaimer and Amulettitan and various control decks were all playing the card and getting tons of 2/2 zombie value out of it, so the last time we really saw Reclaimer being big, and it even had its own deck at the time, the green-white Reclaimer deck that F. Paulus built, was when Field of the Dead was legal. And the reason for that is because of the fact that Field of the Dead itself is a very powerful tutor target. So, what exactly happened to those Reclaimer decks, and why are they gone now, and why don't we see as much of Reclaimer as before? Well, Field of the Dead has been banned. However, somewhat recently, a new card was printed in the form of Urza Saga that makes Reclaimer a good, worthy consideration once again. And like I mentioned before, Reclaimer's power as a threat relies on being able to search for threatening lands. So, just like when Field of the Dead was legal, having an untapped Reclaimer that you can activate and find Field of the Dead, the fact that you can find a Field of the Dead with a Reclaimer requires your opponent to answer it before they lose to the powerful land that you're about to search for, right? So Urza Saga is very much the same thing. if you untap with the Reclaimer, that basically means that you can search for an Urza Saga, and therefore the Reclaimer is just as threatening as it would be to put an Urza Saga into play. So, of course, one of the interesting things to note about Reclaimer itself is that its power level is very, very much connected to the type of lands that it can search for. And if there is no threatening land that makes Reclaimer itself a threat, then typically your opponent can just ignore your Reclaimer. Like, for example, if they're playing Blood Moon or something, and they're not afraid of you getting an Urza Saga because it'll just die to the Blood Moon ability, then Reclaimer is not quite as threatening, although that doesn't mean that it's not useful, and we'll cover that in more detail. But anyways, I wanted to touch on that and introduce you guys to the concept of searching for Urza Saga with Elvish Reclaimer. Right now, this is kind of the thing that's propping Elvish Reclaimer up, and I personally feel like Urza Saga might be a mainstay for the modern format, as the format has settled since the printing. It feels like a very powerful card, but one that's very beatable, very hateable, and so is it a potential choice for a ban in the future? Maybe, but as long as Urza Saga, or for that matter, any other land that makes Reclaimer a threat is available in Modern, then Reclaimer will be a fine choice, because at the very worst, the Reclaimer can just tap 2 and search for a very powerful, threatening land, and if that land is good enough, then Reclaimer is good enough. Now, let's talk about some of the benefits of playing Reclaimer. We're going to cover these each in more detail in the future, but this is just to give you a general idea. With Reclaimer, Amulet is capable of killing your opponent with a line that involves getting 2 Sagas and 2 Amulets, therefore, from the Sagas, and killing your opponent with a Titan that way, and we'll cover that in more detail very, very soon. But just so you know that is a possibility I'm mentioning here. Reclaimer is also a way for the deck to have a repeatable, like, ramp on a stick, so to speak. A 1-mana 1/2 that lets you ramp pretty much every turn is very good. It also is capable of finding hate for your opponent's graveyard, or even for your own graveyard, to play around various cards your opponents could have. So being able to interact with your opponent's graveyard and your own graveyard can be very powerful, and we'll look at that in detail as well as being able to find just general, like, specific pieces of the Amulet combo, whether it's a bounce land or a Tolari West to find Titan or whatever. Again, we'll cover that. And then finally, Reclaimer obviously can be used to find several bullet lands, so to speak, against specific matchups. So to start on that topic, let's first look at the double Saga kill when it comes to Reclaimer. This particular combo is going to line up to do 20 damage with a single Primeval Titan and 32 damage with 2 Titans. And the way this works is Reclaimer is able to search for 2 Sagas, and those 2 Sagas will replace themselves with 2 Amulets, and the Reclaimer itself will generate some mana to kill your opponent. And so all this requires is to have 1 Reclaimer that your opponent has not killed, 1 Reclaimer that you can activate. It has to survive for 2 turns for this to work. And you also have to have 2 lands in play and a single Titan in hand. Just having a Reclaimer that's active, 2 lands, and a Titan is enough to generate a kill from almost nothing. And so the line goes like this. On your opponent's instep, you'll activate your Reclaimer for a Saga, sacrificing one of the 2 lands you have in play. And then you'll untap, and on your upkeep, before you draw, you'll go ahead and activate Reclaimer a second time, and this one is going to fetch a second Saga. So you'll have 2 Sagas on 1, and you'll move to your main phase where they'll both tick up to 2. And so now, you pass back to your opponent. They have a 1-turn window to kill the Reclaimer and or the Sagas, and if they don't, then on your next turn, when you untap, you'll go to your main phase, and both of your Sagas will trigger up to 3 to put these chapter abilities on the stack to go search for a 1 or 0 mana artifact. And in response to this, we're going to float 2 mana, and we're going to go ahead and let the first Saga resolve, and that'll fetch us up our first Amulet, right? We'll still have these 2 mana floating, a Saga in play with its chapter ability on the stack, and an untapped Reclaimer. So we're going to go ahead and take advantage of that by using the 2 mana to activate our Reclaimer and sacrifice the Saga before it gets sacrificed to its own ability to find a bounce land, let's say a Simic Growth Chamber. And since we now have an Amulet from the first Saga, it's going to untap our Simic Growth Chamber. We're going to float 2 mana with that Growth Chamber, and we're going to pick it back up and put it in our hand. So now we're clear to let the second Urza Saga trigger resolve, and that gets us a second Amulet. So now we have a Reclaimer that's tapped, 2 Amulets in play, and a bounce land in hand with 2 mana floating. So we're going to start our main phase by playing out our bounce land, and it'll enter tapped with a bounce trigger, and then we'll put 2 Amulets on top. We'll untap, float 2, untap, float 2. So plus the 2 that was floated before, that's a total of 6 mana. We pick up the land, and that's enough to play a Titan right there. And given that your opponent is tapped out or otherwise just F6 or whatever, you can kill your opponent right then and there when you resolve your Titan by searching for Slayer Stronghold and Boros Garrison to activate twice for +4/+0 haste and vigilance, so it'll be a 10/6 Titan. Then you'll attack, and you'll get Vesuva to copy the Boros Garrison that should still be in play by this point, and a Sunhome. You'll float 4 mana with the Garrison and activate Sunhome to double strike your first Titan for a total of 20 damage. And if you have a second Titan, you can use the first Titan to find lands to cast the second Titan. And then the second Titan is going to find your Boros Garrison, Slayer Stronghold to haste both Titans. You attack with both, and you set up Sunhome to double strike both of your Titans. And that's going to be 8 times 2 for each Titan, so it's 16. 16 plus 16 is 32 damage. So with 1 Titan, you're able to kill your opponent from 20. With 2 Titans, you can kill your opponent through blockers, or if they've gained some life or whatever, and do a total of 32 damage. And that's not even considering the possibility that you have a Dryad or a Pact for Dryad in hand and trying to set up Valakut kills or something like that. You know, that's just, we're gonna leave all that behind, because at that point, that's pretty much unnecessary, since just having a single Titan or 2 Titans as well is just lethal from that point. So over the course of 2 turns, your Reclaimer sets up double Saga that sets up double Amulet that lets you cast Titan and win the game. So that is the threat that Reclaimer presents in the Amulet deck. Just like straight up just trying to kill them with Titan, if you're not just going to sit there and activate Saga for some construct tokens and try to kill them that way, the slow way. So that's just the baseline for Reclaimer as a threat. However, let's look at the case where you're not able to just go straight into the combo with your Reclaimer. Let's say you're afraid of running into a Spreading Seas from your opponent, being able to just kill your Saga or a Blood Moon or something like that, or you think your Reclaimer is not going to survive, they're just going to Fatal Push it or something. Well, then you might choose to go with a slower, more ramp-oriented route, and that's because Reclaimer has the ability to set up several possibilities for ramp lands. The one that's most famous when it comes to playing Elvish Reclaimer is Flagstones of Trocaire, which is a legendary white land that reads, when it is put into the graveyard from play, search your library for planes and put it into play tapped if you do shuffle your library. So you can pay 2, sacrifice the Flagstones to Reclaimer, and then search for a land from the Flagstones, the plains, as well as searching for the land from the Reclaimer. So you end up being a land up in that exchange, and therefore Reclaimer is ramping you. And in fact, you can even use your Reclaimer to search for a second Flagstones, and then next turn sacrifice that Flagstones and ramp again. So just by virtue of activating a Reclaimer and having Flagstones or setting up Flagstones, you can begin to ramp without having to actually play any cards after the Reclaimer itself. So that's one useful thing that Reclaimer can do. However, of course, you can also just search for a Castle Garenbrig, as it'll take your mana required to get to Titan from 5 plus the Castle Garenbrig to 4 lands to activate Castle Garenbrig. And in essence, it basically reduces the cost of your Primeval Titan by 1. So technically, just switching a forest for a Castle Garenbrig by activating a Reclaimer is ramping you, because it's allowing you to get to that Titan a turn faster. And one other thing I wanted to point out here is, affectionately, F. Paulus and his fans, including myself, sometimes like to call the Reclaimer Flagstones combo Splinter Twin, because in theory, it is able to win the game on the spot, pretty much. It's kind of a bit of a meme, but it's a little funny bit of information there I thought that you might enjoy, because I enjoy it, so. Anyways, that's using Reclaimer as a ramp, but we're also able to use Reclaimer to get a ton of utility. Not only does it serve as a threat and as a ramp piece, but Reclaimer can also search for a variety of useful toolbox lands. In fact, these are lands that Amulet typically plays naturally in the main board, even Bojuka Bog sometimes. So Amulet Titan is uniquely in a great position to take advantage of the Reclaimer's ability to find any specific land that you might be wanting out of your deck at any given time in any given matchup. In fact, you may be familiar with the fact that current Amulet lists oftentimes play one expedition map in the main board in order to search it up with Urza's Saga, because sometimes just having that ability to find one specific land, even at the cost of 2 mana, is just very valuable. Sometimes it's irreplaceable and even better than an Amulet. So if that doesn't say anything about the state of things when it comes to being able to use Reclaimer for the same ability, I don't know what else would. And let's cover a couple of lands in specific that Reclaimer can utilize that make it valuable to be playing in the first place. So the first one, and I would consider this one to be the most important utility land when it comes to Reclaimer, is Bojuka Bog, a land that enters the battlefield tapped and exiles one player's graveyard when it comes into play. And of course, being able to search for this for Reclaimer at instant speed allows you to interact with a graveyard at instant speed, be it your opponent's or your own. So like, for example, if your opponent's playing some sort of graveyard-reliant combo deck, like Storm, which casts its graveyard with Pass and Flames, or Living End and Reanimator, which brings stuff back from the graveyard, as well as Oops All Spells, which is very similar. They have a very long and complicated line, but it involves bringing stuff back from the graveyard. These are all things that just having an untapped Reclaimer in play can just stop. You play turn 1 Reclaimer, then you go to your next turn, you play a land and pass, and all of a sudden, your opponent can't combo off with their Living End or their Reanimation piece or whatever, because if they do, you can just tap, sacrifice a land, Reclaimer out a Bojuka Bog, and exile their graveyard and stop their combo right then and there. And then, of course, there are some decks that are not all in on their graveyard, but they do use their graveyard as a resource. This can include decks that play delve threats like Murktide Regent, or things that can come back from the graveyard and have an annoying effect like Kroxa. This also includes any deck that's playing Lurrus as a companion. If they're hoping to get value from Lurrus, being able to Reclaimer out a Bojuka Bog and then pick it up with some bounce lands for repeated use means that Lurrus is not going to get them a whole lot of value in that particular matchup. It's also good against Delirium and Tarmogoyf, anything that has an effect that wants to count certain number of cards in the graveyard, in particular card types. Being able to Bojuka Bog to reduce that count can be quite good. And then there's also the tech ability of targeting your own self with Bojuka Bog to exile your own graveyard. Say, for example, your opponent is trying to Surgical Extraction your Primeval Titan because they're playing Mill. You can just Reclaimer for Bojuka Bog and exile your graveyard in order to stop them from removing all the Titans from your deck. Similar things if they're trying to counter something with Drown in the Loch or like kill a Dryad. You can exile your own graveyard and make it so that their Drown in the Loch fizzles. Things along those lines. And just in general, I find that Bojuka Bog has a fantastic impact on many different matchups. And I think that being able to search for Bojuka Bog with Reclaimer is one of the big reasons why Reclaimer is even played at all. So that's the one I wanted to mention first. However, it's also possible to just find, in general, what you might call a missing piece when it comes to Reclaimer, searching for a Valakut to go along with your Dryad in order to get some Valakut triggers, searching for a Talari West to search for a Primeval Titan by transmuting, or maybe set up an explosive or something like that. And also just to find a bounce land when either you're missing land drops and you want to ensure that you have a land to play for this turn. You can search for a bounce land, pick up a land, and then play your land for turn, or you can just set up a bounce land when you don't have one, but you do have an amulet, and you want to start getting mana from your amulet. Those are some of the things that Reclaimer can do if it's not doing something totally busted. But, of course, there are also several bullet lands that Amulet already plays naturally for the most part. These include things like Cavern of Souls, which Reclaimer can search for to invalidate your opponent's counter magic. This includes just being able to search for basic forests against an opponent that you suspect is playing Blood Moon or Mages of the Moon, and try not to die to those annoying red cards. You can also search for Ghost Quarter against Tron lands or against Sagas and Bounce lands to try to have a way to interact with your opponent's land-based combos. There are a number of different bullet lands, and Reclaimer is able to get all of those in those specific matchups. So all this is great and all, but of course, when you're getting something good out of adding a card to your deck, you're also losing something. And so what is the catch when it comes to playing with Reclaimer? Well, I'm going to cover this in great detail. However, before I get to this particular topic, there's something important to talk about, which is the point of mana bases, because how you choose to build your Reclaimer deck, whether you choose to build it as a mono green or Selesnya, which is green and white, that is going to have a big impact on the way that you build your deck and the effect that Reclaimer has on your deck. So we'll come back to this. I'm going to touch on the mana bases for just a second, and we'll get right back to that. So first of all, you can choose to, as I like to say, contort the mana base for flagstones, because white is not a color that Amulet traditionally plays. Playing a card like Flagstones or Trocaire, even though it comes in untapped, a white mana is just not useful. It's not going to cast any of your turn 1 drops, including the Reclaimer itself. It's not going to help you activate Castle Garenbrig. There's many reasons not to be splashing colors in the Amulet mana base. One of the biggest is Castle Garenbrig itself, being able to play it and activate it. Castle Garenbrig is very important, in my opinion, for Amulet as it currently stands. So it is possible, however, to play Flagstones and these plains, the Temple Gardens that you have to have in order to be able to search for something with Flagstones in your deck. However, it does require some dedication. It requires that you make some space. Not only are you going to make space for your 4 Reclaimers, but also your 2 to 4 Flagstones, depending on how hard you want to go on that, and at least 3 Temple Gardens, so that you always have something to search for when you sacrifice your Flagstones. And so the effect this is going to have is, and this is going to be true for all Reclaimer decks, this first point, is an increased land count, as you want to make sure that you have access to all the lands that you want to have access to with your Reclaimer, including a mainboard Bojuka Bog, for example. But in this particular case, we were playing Flagstones as well, so you're typically going to have 34, 35 lands as compared to the usual 32 or 33 in a typical Amulet list. And like I said, that's going to be true for the mono green list as well. However, the next couple are specifically a result of playing white, which is cutting Explorer often entirely. You usually don't have the luxury of playing Explorer at all. when you're playing both Reclaimer and the White Splash, as well as the fact that you won't be able to play as many Castle Garenbrig as you may like. You usually can only afford to play one copy, sometimes two. It's pushing it a bit. And then you have to relegate all of your Arboreal Grazers to the sideboard if you choose to play them at all. So you typically have like one Arboreal Grazer in the main board, and then that's it. You might see them in the sideboard to bring in for aggressive matchups, but typically you end up just cutting them. There's one thing to note here as well, which is there will be times in the sideboarding where we'll cut Reclaimer from the main deck because of a specific matchup they're not as good in. And usually when that happens, we'll end up siding out Flagstones as well. I just wanted to mention that ahead of time. However, of course, you are doing all this work for a reason. You're getting access to the Flagstones package so you can ramp very easily with Reclaimer. And just naturally having a turn 2 Flagstones and activate Reclaimer after playing it on turn 1 can be quite good. You also get, in addition to that, a couple of interesting white cards, including Eldamri's Call, a 2-mana tutor for a creature. Any creature, not just a green creature like Summoner's Pact. And that can be quite good, especially with the card Endurance. There are other cards as well, specifically sideboard cards that tend to see play in the White Splash Reclaimer lists. This includes Rest in Peace to nuke all the graveyards. This includes Prismatic Ending to interact with 1-drops like Death Shadow or Ragavan or whatever it might be. And Celestial Purge as well as a card that can hate out Ashioks and Blood Moons and Death Shadows and Grist and all sorts of problematic permanents. So these cards can come in handy. And, of course, if you're already splashing white, that means that if you have drawn a single Valakut, or any red source for that matter, if you happen to be playing a Gruul Turf, then it's going to be a little easier to activate your Sunhome and Slayer Stronghold, as you might just have a Temple Garden lying around. So, and then finally, of course, being able to get up to 3 and 4 colors for explosives is a little bit easier when you're splashing a color, because you're already playing green, you're splashing blue for Tularia West, and then you also have red and white for the Slayers, Stronghold, and Sunhome stuff that's going on. So getting up to 4 colors, even 5 colors if you have Bojuka Bog, is quite possible when it comes to setting up engineered explosives. So that is one benefit as well. However, I personally have been playing very recently my own personal innovation when it comes to the Reclaimer mana base. And the reason I say that is because I literally have not seen another person playing mono green Reclaimer for whatever reason I do not understand. But of course, I'm just a FNM warrior, so to speak. I don't really play in big events. I just play on Magic Online and leagues and stuff. For the heck of it, I play in FNM at my locals, but I don't really play in big tournaments, so I can't speak to any, like, fantastic finishes that this particular strategy has. However, my personal experience is that when you're playing Elvish Reclaimer, you don't actually need to play the white and the Flagstones that everybody seems to think that you do. I think that Reclaimer is good enough on its own, and by choosing not to play white, you gain access to a couple of valuable things. First of all, you're not playing Flagstones, which can sometimes stop you from having a turn 1 play like Grazer or Reclaimer. It never activates Garenbrig, and it's really bad when you're trying to cast Colossus, and you've got Flagstones as a land that just doesn't... It basically taps for colorless mana, it might as well. And, of course, if you're trying to play Colossus as well, the next point is a huge one. You can play as many Castle Garenbrigs as you like in the mono-green Reclaimer lists, as you don't have to trim them and make them less reliable when you're playing white. Instead, if you're playing mono-green, you can easily activate them, you can easily play them untapped, and you can play as many as you need because you're not making room for all these plains and Flagstones. So you get your Castle Garenbrigs back, which I think is extremely valuable. You also are not taking as much damage by fetch shocking Temple Garden all the time, which you might end up doing in sideboard games, and even in mainboard games if you're trying to set up an Eladamri's Call. So you're not taking as much damage, which makes your aggressive matchups a little bit better. And of course, you don't end up with cards stranded in your hand with no way to cast them, in particular your white sideboard cards. Sometimes, as much work as you put into the mana base trying to make sure you'll have access to your white, you'll have a Prismatic Ending or a Celestial Purge in your hand and absolutely no way to cast it, and that is the worst feeling in the world. It happens frequently with Eladamri's Call as well. And of course, you are not going to be able to play Eladamri's Call if you're not playing white, but I don't find that to be a huge loss personally. And like I said, this is something that I have come up with and that I'm giving to you now as part of this presentation because I feel like it's useful information. But of course, if you disagree and you think that the white splash is necessary when it comes to playing Reclaimer, then please, by all means, I'll be in the comments below looking for your comments, and I'd love to know what you think about it. So, and of course, if I'm going to address playing without Flagstones, I should address how Reclaimer can be good without Flagstones. So obviously, Reclaimer can still search for Saga and set you up with an amulet, which will ramp you eventually once you find a bounce land, or if you already have a bounce land, setting up an amulet in a couple turns really actually will get you to Titan faster. So you don't necessarily need Flagstones for that. especially if you know that your Sagas are good to go and they're not going to be leaving the battlefield anytime soon. Of course, and like I said, you can set up Castle Garenbrig as well, as it only requires 4 mana to activate instead of needing a total of 6 mana to play your Titan. You can just use 4 in a castle, so that does technically ramp you by 1, and that comes up a lot. Just reclaiming away a force to search for a castle to make sure that you can cast Titan more easily. Happens a lot in the mono green deck. And of course, like I mentioned, Reclaimer is not just for ramp. Reclaimer is used for being a threat and setting up threatening lands. It's also used for utility, so in any matchup where setting up a Saga and grinding out with construct tokens, or trying to go straight for the combo, or searching for Bojuka Bog, if any of those things is good in the matchup, then you don't actually need the ramp, because the Reclaimer does something useful already. So, anyways. Now, we're going to talk about some accommodations that are made to the stock list in order to play Reclaimer, and I'll start with the typical Selesnya list. So, first of all, Reclaimer lists that are in the business of playing white typically will play 2 to 3 copies of Flagstones of Trocaire and around 3 Temple Gardens in the main board. There are some lists that play as many as 4 Flagstones or as few as 2 Temple Gardens, but those are kind of the general numbers. And of course, you do get to play with 2 or more copies of Eladamri's Call. I think 2 is the most popular number. I think I've seen 3 as well. And of course, if you're actually splashing white, you're going to be favoring Selesnya Sanctuary over Gruul Turf by a wide margin, so you'll be playing typically 4 copies of Sanctuary and 0 Gruul Turfs. You'll also be making room for that mainboard Bojuka Bog, as I mentioned before. If you're playing Reclaimer without a mainboard Bog, there's almost no point, because Bog is one of the best things to search for with Reclaimer, in my opinion, so... Although, you'll sometimes see a copy of Kabir Crossroads, which I've pictured on the right here, a life gain land as well, because it happens to tap for white, so that helps you cast your sideboard cards, which, speaking of, you'll frequently play some number of Prismatic Endings, sometimes some Celestial Purges, or some Rest in Peace in the sideboard, as one of the benefits that you get for playing white. But, of course, this all comes at a cost. You cannot play more than 2 Castle Garenbrigs at all. Most lists play 1 or 0, sometimes I've seen that, but I very rarely see a Reclaimer list that's playing white that has more than 1 copy of Castle Garenbrig, which is really unfortunate. You also can't play Breeding Pool, as you're using those slots with your green-white Shocklands. Once the Bant Triome comes out, I'm sure it'll probably be a Bant Triome and 2 Temple Gardens, or something like that, so maybe that will not be as big of an issue in the future, but of course, without Breeding Pool, you have no way to fetch and be able to search with Tolari West, as having that blue can sometimes be very important, and you don't get to play the Breeding Pool in the Selesnya lists. You also only play 1 Cavern of Souls in the main board, as you're making room for all these additional white lands, and you have to trim down on Grazers and Explorers both. You can only play 1 to 2 copies of Grazer in the Selesnya lists, and you can't play almost any copies of Explorer. Sometimes there's a couple, because you're choosing to favor Explorer over Azusa or something like that, and you're not playing any Colossus. Those are all things that you can do, but you definitely have to make a lot of concessions, mostly to the mana base, when it comes to playing the Selesnya list. Now, to compare this directly to the mono-green list, this is what you're going to be looking at playing mono-green. You usually get to play the split of Selesnya and Gruul Turf that you like. I personally prefer 3 Selesnyas and 1 Gruul Turf, and many others do as well, but I've also seen 2 and 2, and honestly, the difference is negligible, but at least you get to play both, which makes you a little bit more resilient against something like Alpine Moon if they're trying to deactivate multiple of your bounce lands, because that's happened to me. Having a split of Selesnya and Gruul Turf can go a long way, instead of just getting caught with double Selesnya in play or something like that. Of course, you're going to be playing your main board Bog, and you do get to play your 3 or more copies of Castle Garenbrig. I am a big fan of this card, and I think that playing at least 3 is very good. You get access to that Breeding Pool, so you can fetch for something to transmute Tolari West, which is invaluable at times. And you also get access to as many Grazers as you want to play. I've played lists with 4 Grazers, with 3 Grazers, with 1 Grazer, but it's all up to your personal choice. You're not forced to do anything. You can play as many Reclaimers and Grazers in your list as you like when you're playing mono-green. And in addition to that, you have the slots to play copies of Explorer or Turntimber Symbiosis or whatever flex slots you like. I've played even Karn in Reclaimer lists that were mono-green, because you just have the freedom to do that. And that's not something you really get the luxury to do in the green-white list, just because so many of your slots are taken up by Flagstones and Temple Gardens. But of course, the trade-off there is that you don't get access to those Flagstones and Temple Gardens, so in order to actually ramp, your Reclaimer can't really do that. I mean, you can set up Castle Garenbrig, but that only works one time, because they don't do anything in multiples, so you get, like, a bit of ramp there, and you can try to set up an amulet, but if your Saga dies, then you're not really able to get anywhere as far as your land count is concerned when it comes to Reclaimer, so it's not as good with Dryad, I suppose, when you're playing mono-green. And of course, you don't get access to the Eldrami's Call and the white sideboard cards. I'm not going to say much about whether I prefer the white sideboard cards to playing mono green, because that's just up to personal preference. So, now we come to the topic of sideboarding with Elvish Reclaimer, and there are a couple of different scenarios that are possible. First of all, you could be playing your Reclaimer deck against a fast deck that has lots of removal, things like Burn, or Death Shadow, or Prowess, where not only are they clocking you quickly, but they also have, Lightning Bolts and Fatal Pushes, and that kind of thing, Terminates, or just Burn has infinite different types of Lightning Bolt effects, Skewer the Critics, that type of stuff, so that when you play your Reclaimer, it's almost always going to die on sight, and even if it doesn't die, these are matchups that go so fast that it may not actually do anything if it survives in the first place. So typically in these types of matchups, you'll end up cutting all 4 copies of Reclaimer to bring in copies of Arboreal Grazer from the sideboard or whatever tools you have for that matchup. So siding out Reclaimer in these types of fast and removal-based opponents, that'll come up a lot. Another type of matchup you'll run into are fair matchups where your opponent is very light on removal or has no removal at all, perhaps. And these types of matchups, typically Reclaimer is trimmed, not cut entirely because it is useful, but it's trimmed to 2 or 3 copies because, honestly, having more than 1 Reclaimer at a time is not usually useful. And the main board is fine because a lot of times your Reclaimer is going to die when you play it, and drawing a second one gives you access to that effect when you otherwise wouldn't, and so it's not redundant. But if you know that your first Reclaimer is likely to survive, then you don't want to draw more copies, so a lot of times you'll end up shaving on Reclaimers in these types of matchups. A lot of times it's versus like tribal decks like Merfolk and Elves, so just as an example. Then there are also combo matchups that don't rely on the graveyard at all. In particular, the ones that come to mind when I think of this kind of genre of deck is Tron and Amulet. These are like land-based, synergy/combo decks where Reclaimer searching for Bog doesn't help you. There's not a whole lot that Reclaimer can help you with. Even searching for a Ghost Quarter, it'll enter tapped. So you'll have to wait a turn for a Reclaimer to be active, then you'll have to activate it and wait a turn for you to untap with Ghost Quarter. And by then, you might just already be dead to these decks. So typically, Reclaimer is going to be trimmed in these matchups. It's not entirely useless, especially if your opponent has a slow draw, so you don't have to cut them entirely, but they're not great in the matchup, and so if you have the cards to board in, then siding out Reclaimer entirely, if you can, makes sense, but it's not at its strongest in these matchups. So, and then finally, the other type of matchup, and the main matchup that I think Reclaimer is here for, are grindy matchups and graveyard-based combo matchups. This includes control decks or grindy red-black or black-green decks that utilize their graveyard but don't rely on it. And of course, it includes those combo decks that heavily rely on their graveyard, be it Storm or Living In or Reanimator or whatever. In these matchups, Reclaimer is fantastic, so you're not really going to be trimming any Reclaimers. You wouldn't want to do that. But if you need things to trim, typically Grazer is a good choice for these types of matchups. So I have an example deck list here by the user Apriolo1, also known as Anthony Priolo in real life. And when it comes to green-white Reclaimer lists, I think nobody on the planet has a better track record and more experience with them than Anthony Priolo. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, Anthony does not have a Twitter or a YouTube or anything like that, so I can't really give you a link to go and follow him or talk to him, pick his mind about his card choices. I believe I saw a Twitter link at some point in time, but it wasn't the same as his online username or something, so I don't really know how to find it. So if you're watching this, Anthony, and you want to be contacted, then drop your stuff in the comments below so people can reach you. But yeah, other than F. Paulus, who might have, might be giving Anthony a run for his money when it comes to the most amount of time played with green-white Reclaimer, I think that Anthony is probably the closest you could consider to an expert on this particular topic. Not only has Anthony been able to place in multiple modern challenges and, prelims and stuff with green-white Reclaimer lists back when nobody was even playing them, this particular list is a 5-0 list from a recent Magic Online deck dump about a couple months ago, maybe July 2nd, and I chose this list because it's one of the more recent ones with Urza Saga, and you'll see a lot of what we were talking about. So we're playing white here, and that means that we've got our 2 flagstones and our 3 Temple Gardens, pretty typical numbers. You'll see that the land count in general is pretty high. We see those 35 lands. And of course, if you look at the deck, you'll see 0 copies of Explorer, like I mentioned. We do get to play a couple copies of Arboreal Grazer, definitely not the full 4, but of course, we're making room for some extra copies. And with that mentioned, in the sideboard, you'll see some of those white sideboard cards that I talked about, like Prismatic Ending and Rest in Peace. And I'm realizing now that one of the reasons why we've got extra slots for extra Grazers and second Azusa and things like that is we're not playing Eldamri's Call in this list, which, if you're playing green-white, I see Eldamri's Call a lot. And of course, I know that Anthony has played his fair share of Call, so you might choose to play that one, you might choose not to. But anyways, like I mentioned, the slots in the main deck are very tight, and so it's hard to fit everything that you would want in a green-white list while still having enough Flagstones and Temple Gardens to go search for with your Reclaimer. So that is an example for the green-white deck list. And for the second example for mono-green, I did have to take, unfortunately, one of my own 5-0 lists from Magic Online. This is not me trying to toot my horn. I literally had to take this one because there's no other option. Nobody else that I have ever seen has gotten 5-0s or even played really a mono-green list. So this is the most recent one that I could find that I actually placed with, and a place where you can find record of it. I did have a more recent, like 4-1 list that I think maybe is more reflective of what I would play at the time, at the current time, but this one's fine enough, and it's proven, at least in the sense that it was reported by Wizards of the Coast and a 5-0 dump, so at least you can look this one up and find it. And like I mentioned, you can play as many Grazers as you like in this style of list. In particular, this list is playing 36 lands plus 2 Timber Symbiosis, which is something I was trying at the time. You don't have to play this many lands. You could cut a Yavimaya, for example, and play an additional Grazer or something. You could definitely work around the mana base. You could cut one copy of Castle Garenbrig if you wanted to fit more things like a second Cavern of Souls or whatever. It's really, really flexible. Like, this list is playing a 5th Forest. It's playing a Yavimaya. It's playing a 4th Castle Garenbrig. You could play an additional bounce land. You could play a Ghost Quarter in the main deck, or a Radiant Fountain, which I don't think this list is playing because I'm not a big fan of it. Like, the mana base and the main board are super flexible. Like, this list is playing Reclaimers, Grazers, Turn Timber Symbiosis, and everything else that you would expect. You might add an Azusa or something, but you have the freedom to do whatever you want with the list. And then, in the sideboard, it's just the typical amulet stuff, as we are not playing those white cards. However, you will notice that this makes use of the Arboreal Grazer in the sideboard. When you're boarding out Reclaimer in these aggressive, fast matchups, it's typical to bring in Grazer to replace it. So that's the reason why you'll see that sometimes. So, anyways, that is the conclusion of my presentation about Reclaimer Amulet. Let me know if you enjoyed this content, if you learned something from it, and also, please let me know if you choose to play the mono-green list, as, like I said, right now, it's kind of just theory crafting. I have the strong hunch that Reclaimer is good enough without splashing white, but I don't really have any proof. And to be honest, I'm probably never going to play it in a Modern Challenge or anything. I don't really play in those types of events, but if you do, then link it to me. You can find my Twitter in the description below. It's attached to my YouTube account and all kinds of stuff, so just find me wherever you can reach me, and I'd love to see your results with it. And, like I said, if there's anyone that you know that is interested in learning this type of content, then share the content with them. Spread out the information so we can get this going, get this talking, and yeah, I don't really have much else to say. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is Redface Menace, signing off.